Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to part one of my lecture on chapter six of the third edition of the Merock MySQL book. Chapter six is about how to code summary uh, queries. I've divided the lecture into parts one and two, not particularly because of the length, but because there are two groups of content within Chapter 6. There's there's the features about summary queries that have been in MySQL for quite a while and were covered in the second edition of the Merock book. Okay, and then there's the stuff at the end of the chapter, which is new to MySQL as of version 8, and it's new to the Merock book as of the third edition. So the part one, the part we're doing now, older material. Part two is going to be the new material that's at the end of the chapter. Okay. Now, I'm having a hard time advancing my slides appropriately, so let me try that again. Here we are. So the objectives for the lecture, I'm going to leave you to read those on your own. Okay, here's the syntax of the aggregate functions. So there's an average, a sum, a min, a max, a count, and a count of all. And what's kind of interesting about the aggregate functions in this summary query feature for SQL is that it's very consistent with the design of SQL as being a language in which you describe the answers that you want rather than the method to compute them. Okay? So, for instance, all along what we've been doing is in chapters 3 and 4 and 5, we've been retrieving rows and columns from in chapter 3 from one table and then on to chapter 4 from two tables, etc. Right? And so we've been describing the rows that we want. We've we've been describing the columns that we want and the rows that we don't want. But we haven't done any summarization. Okay, and this isn't a language where you have to get the detail data from a query and then summarize it yourself. There's a way in the select to just ask for summary answers rather than the detail rows, and that's what we're going to learn about in chapter 6. And in which way can we summarize them? Well, we can ask for the average, the sum, the min, the max, and the count. Okay? Okay. So here's a summary query, a pretty basic one. We're selecting a count of asterisk, and I'll come back to what that means, as number of invoices, has a column alias. We have a sum of, and then we have a formula, which you'll recognize as the formula that we use for balance due. These are 3 columns on invoices. And we're using a column alias there as a total due from invoices where, and then we have the formula for balance due is greater than 0. Okay. And what do we get? Well, we get a result set with one row. And the number of invoices is 11. And the total due is 32,000 and some change. Okay, and so you can see that what we've done is we have counted the qualifying rows. Okay, that's the rows that pass the where test. Okay, and we have summed up um, the the balance due, and we're calling the sum of that the total due. Okay, and I just want to show you. I just want to run that for you in Workbench. Okay, so I'm going to go over here to Workbench, bring Workbench onto this monitor so you can see it. And let's run this again. And you can see it ran fine. And we get the same answers from the textbook. Number of invoices 11. And then the total due 32,020 and 42 cents. Okay, and that worked just great. So you'll notice that the column specifications that we had, they both have summary functions in them. Okay, and generally speaking, when you're doing a summary query, your columns are going to use summary functions. We can use a couple of other columns in some circumstances, but they're limited. Okay. Now, if you summarize and you don't have a clause called a group by, well, then you get a summary for all the qualifying rows. So you just get one line. You know, what's the count of all the qualifying rows? What's the sum of that formula in all the qualifying rows? Okay, so that works just fine. Okay, about what you would expect. All right, now, what can go wrong? Well, one of the things that can go wrong is you can ask for columns that you're not entitled to see. Okay, and throughout the chapter here, we're going to explore what that means. But generally speaking, when you're summarizing something, you can't ask to display a regular column because whatever the value is for that is going to be different on different rows. Okay, so what value would it put into that column? So for instance, if we come over here to this other thing, I just took a copy of the query that we had before. In fact, why don't we prove we did that? And I've added invoice date. Okay, but instead of that, let's put that request for invoice date into a column. Okay, so this should be functionally the same as the query we just did. Run it, and you see we get the same answer. Okay, but what if we ask for one of the columns in invoices? We didn't use any kind of a summary function. We didn't surround it with a summary function. What would happen? Well, we get an error. So let's see that we get the error. So down here, well, in fact, let me clear this and we'll see just the error we get for this. Okay, there it is. So we had to use AP, and then we say there's our select and has an error code 1140. I'm going to right click on this, copy the response, and I'm just going to paste it into some text editor. This here on the Mac, I tend to use this TextMate a lot because, well, it's handy and I kind of like it. Okay, let me make the text a little bigger. And what's it saying? Well, it's saying in an aggregated query without a group by, expression 1 of the select list, that's where he asks for invoice date, contains a non-aggregated column. This is incompatible with SQL mode only full group by. So there are two questions. One is that mechanically, why are we getting the error? Okay, why are we in SQL mode only for full group by? Okay, but the other is that why is it reasonable to not allow expressions like that in these kind of queries, which is why we turn on only full group by. So let's talk about only full group by. Um, how do we get that? Well, let's just take a look. When we install the product, okay, for quite a while now, over a year, and I'm doing this in the fall of 2019. For well over a year, that's been the default. Okay, and I'm so glad that they changed that to the default. Okay, and in my course, I give you a script that I want you to run that sets the settings that we care about, to tell the server what the settings are that we care about. And one of the things that we select is this only full group by. Okay, so that means server, be strict when you're doing summary functions and don't allow us to make silly requests that wouldn't make sense. Okay. Okay. So for instance, if we go back to the query that failed, okay, we asked for the invoice date. The invoice date for which of the invoices? We've got 11 that qualify. Okay, they're not all the same invoice date. If it had to pick one, back in the old days when it didn't complain about this quite so much, it would have given you the first one. It would have given you the one from row 1. But what do you get? You get a really misleading result set because that's not summarized at all. You're not getting the average one. You're not getting the most frequent one. If in fact you turn off this only full group by feature, at least what you used to get is you got the first one. Very misleading. Okay. As a result, we can't do this anymore. Okay. Instead, when we get this error, we have to go, oh, you know what? In this kind of a summary query that doesn't have a group by, I can only have column expressions that include some kind of summary function. Okay? So I can't have invoice date because there's nothing reasonable to put in it. Okay, so that puts us back to the original version that we had, and we run that and it works. Okay? So, if we're not using a group by, we can expect one line in the result set. We can expect all of the column expressions that we put these column specification. We can expect all of them to include a summary function. Okay, so this says count of asterisk. What does this mean? A count of all the rows that pass the where test. Okay, so count of all qualifying rows. Okay, kind of like when we say select and then we used asterisk for all to select all the columns. This is the way we count all the rows. Okay, makes sense? All right, so that's pretty straightforward. And that error is one that we want to avoid. If you get the error, you ought to be able to come back up here and say, oh, you know, I'm asking for something that's not summarized. All right? Good. Now let's put a pin in that till we need to talk about it again. Okay, so that's a simple summary query. This is a summary query with count, average, and sum. Okay, so this is, so we say select after 1/1/2018, so that's a literal, that's going to be the same in every row. Count of asterisk, that's going to be a count of the qualifying rows. Round, average of invoice total to 2 decimal places. Nice to see the round here because as soon as we average something with dollars and cents, we run the possibility we're going to get fractional cents, and that's not going to be pretty. So we rounded that to 2 decimal places. And then the sum of invoice total. From invoices where the invoice date is greater than 2018-1/1. Okay? And we have 114 invoices. That's all of the ones in the invoices table. Average invoices a little over 1879. Total invoice amount a little over 214,000. Okay, so that one worked fine. And you'll notice the column specifications that we have here, they all have a summary function in them. Okay, that's what we should expect. The other thing that we should know here with these summary queries where we don't have a group by is we don't need an order by if we're only expecting one line of output. So if you don't have a group by, then you're going to get one line. You're going to get the summary for the entire set of qualifying rows. So you don't need an order by because you don't need to order. There's no way. There's only one way to order a single row, right? Good. Okay, here's a summary query with min and max. Okay, so same thing. After 1/1/2018, count of asterisk, so that's a count of all the qualifying rows, max of invoice total, min of invoice total. Okay, do we have to round here? No, we don't have to round here because the min and the max will be values of the column for particular rows, and they're just dollars and cents. So it's only when we average that we generate fractional cents, potentially. Okay, so then we need to round to 2 decimal places. From invoices, and again, where the invoice date is greater than 2018-1/1. So again, we got 114. The highest invoice total is $37,966. The lowest is $6. Okay, and again, every one of the column specifications has a summary function in it, right? Okay, can we use summary functions for non-numeric columns? Yes, we can. Is it useful? Well, you tell me. So we're selecting the minimum vendor name and the maximum vendor name and the count of vendor name as number of vendors. Okay, so what's the count of the vendor name do? The count of the vendor name will count all vendor names that are not null. Okay, so if vendor names are not allowed to be null, which is probably true, it's probably the same as you had done count asterisk, count of asterisk. Okay, so the first vendor is Abbey Office Furnishing. The last one, Zilka Design. There are 122 vendors. Now, how useful is it to do this on character strings? Well, I don't find it really useful, but maybe you can find a use for it. Okay? The point is that you can do it. Okay, distinct. Okay, so we can use distinct here as well. Okay, so we're saying, let's see, we're getting it. We are selecting from invoices, and the same thing where the invoice date is after the first day of 2018. We want the count of distinct vendor ID as the number of vendors, the count of vendor ID as the number of invoices, uh, round the average of invoice total to 2 decimal places and sum the invoice total, which you don't have to round because it won't get fractional sense. So the answer is 34 vendors, 114 invoices, average invoice amount, 1879 and change, total invoice amount, 214,000 and some little bit more. So I think the interesting things here to look at are distinct and count. Okay. So you'll notice that the first column specification that we had is counting distinct vendor ID, and the second one is counting vendor ID. Okay, so what's that going to do? Well, it's really important to, when you figure out what these counts are going to do, think of the values in the column in relation to the table that you're in. Okay, are we in the vendors table? No, we're not. Okay, we're in the invoices table. So is it possible, if we were in the vendors table, right? Well, each row would have a distinct vendor ID because it's the primary key. All right. Here in invoices, it's not the primary key. It's a foreign key that points to the vendor. Okay. And so if we want to get a count of just the vendors, the different vendors, even though there might be multiple rows for the same one, the way to squish that down and only count the distinct vendors is to put distinct before vendor ID. On this next column where we count vendor ID, we're going to count all the rows in which the vendor ID is not null. Well, that's all the rows. It's all the qualifying rows. Okay, 114. Now, I would say that this is a good way to characterize the difference between using the distinct keyword and not using it. Okay, I just would point out that if this were me and I were not trying to make this teaching point, I would have counted either asterisk or the invoice ID to make it clear that we're counting all the rows or that the rows are one row per invoice ID. Okay. Now, why did they use the vendor ID? To set up this, to juxtapose the use of distinct and not using a distinct with the same column name. Okay. Typically, when you think about this, distinct doesn't help us if we're talking about the primary key. The primary key is always unique per row. Okay. And so one of the reasons why this is a meaningful use of distinct is that the vendor ID is not the primary key of this table. Next. Okay, so it's useful to have a summary of all of the rows, okay? But wouldn't it be helpful to be able to have summary statistics for subsets, for groups within the result set? Yeah, it would be. This is a pretty typical reporting use case. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we add two more clauses to select: group by and having. Okay, essentially the group by describes how to group the rows when you're summarizing, and having It acts like the where clause, but for groups, not for individual rows. There's a little bit of extra thought there, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward. So uh, we'll get to it in just a minute. Okay, so let's see. Um, this is here's a query here on slide number 10. It has both an order by and a having. Okay, I'm sorry. It has a group by, a having, and an order by. What was I saying back here? Yeah. Okay. So we're doing, we're selecting from invoices. We want to group by vendor ID. Okay. That makes sense because vendor ID, again, it's not the primary key. Okay. So there's going to be multiple rows per vendor ID. That's a useful grouping. Okay. And we want the vendor ID. We want to round the average of the invoice total to 2 decimal places and give it a name. Okay. Now, we don't have a where clause. Okay. But we do have a having. And having says, once you've done the grouping, okay, and you've calculated the summary values, okay, I want to eliminate some of the group rows by having by using the having test. So this says I only want to include a row if the average of the invoice total added up for that group is greater than 2,000. Okay, now the first time I see this, I'm going to expect every row in the result set to be greater than 2,000. Okay, so let's look at average invoice total. 2,000, 10,000, 7,000, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000, 2,000, 2,000. They're all greater than 2,000. Okay, so that's how we know for sure that our having worked. Okay, and we have the vendor ID. Okay, now, didn't we say a while ago that when we're doing these summary queries, we don't want to include normal columns that are not summarized? Well, that was true when we weren't doing group by. When we're doing group by, we can include the columns that we're grouping on, and then we have this other thing, and we'll get to an example of it in a slide or two. We can also have a column that's dependent on the group by column. And by that we mean it's a column that would always have the same value for that vendor ID. Okay? So we're grouping by a vendor ID, then we can show the vendor ID. In fact, we want to, or else it's going to be hard to read the report. Okay? So that's how that works. Okay? Now, can we just pick anything and ask for that? Right? No, we can't. Okay, so let's take this one and let's paste it into Workbench. Okay, let's get another query in Workbench and throw a semicolon on that and throw a use AP up here just to do things the way we do them in our class. Okay, and let's do that one. Let's run it. Okay, looks like we get the same answers. Okay, and we said select a vendor ID. I bet we can maybe beautify this a little bit more. Yeah, we did. Okay, now we can see the vendor ID a little bit better. Okay, but what if we what if we picked something like invoice date and threw that in? Okay, it's from invoices. It's there. Okay. So let's say invoice date. Let's throw that in. Okay. And the editor doesn't mind. I mean, it's the name of a proper column, but the server's going to mind. So let's clear off the errors and let's give it a run. And we're going to get the same problem down here we had before. Error code 1055. And again, we can copy this and we can paste it over top of this thing. It says the same error. No, it's a slightly different error code. 1055. Expression 2 is not in a group by clause and contains a non-aggregated column, which is not functionally dependent on the group by clause. Okay, and we're in SQL mode equals only full group by. Okay, so vendor ID is okay because we're grouping by vendor ID. Invoice date is not okay because it's not in the group by. Certain other columns will be okay if they're dependent on the vendor ID, but we didn't get there yet. Okay, so we can't do this, right? So even when you're doing a group by, you look at the column specifications, and either they have some kind of summary function, or they're one of the columns that you're grouping by, or they're closely related to that column, and we didn't get to that yet. Okay, but you can't throw invoice date in because why? Because it would have a different value for each of the things that we're trying to summarize into a single row. So what would we put into that column? Well, if you turn off the only full group by, at least it used to put the first one in. It used to put the one for the first row. Very misleading. Okay, so we keep it in only full group by. We don't fool around with asking for misleading columns, which means we can't add that in. Okay? All right. Now, let's go to the next one. This is it. A summary query that includes a functionally dependent column. Okay. So they say select vendor name, vendor state, and then we have round average invoice total. Okay, we have a summary function here for the third column specifications. From vendors join invoices, then we have the on clause, group by vendor name, having average invoice total greater than 2,000. Okay. Now, why can we ask for vendor state? Okay. Now, did we get the answer for that? No. So this should work. They don't show it working. So let's show it working, right? Going to copy that. Go over to Workbench. Get a new, well, I'm just going to put it right on top of here. Okay. So let's do that and run it. And it runs just fine. Okay. So we get the vendor name, we get the vendor state. Why does that work? Well, it works because vendor state is dependent upon vendor name. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because the primary key in vendor is really vendor ID. Okay, and then vendor name has a requirement that it has to be unique. Okay, so uh, because of that, uh, vendor state depends on vendor ID, but vendor name is kind of a proxy for vendor ID because it has to be unique. All right. So we can ask for the state. Okay. If we ask for something else, like the invoice date, that wouldn't be the same by vendor, we would get an error. Okay. So we can ask for the vendor name because that's going to be all the same per summarized row. We can ask for the vendor state because that'll be all the same per summarized row. We can't ask for something like invoice date because that's going to be different on each of the rows that gets summarized into a summarized row, and we just don't have a reasonable value to put there. Okay. Whereas when we summarize the rows when we group by vendor name, well, the group all has the same vendor name and they all have the same vendor state. That's why that works. Okay. Good. Now, what else do we have here? Here's a summary query that counts the number of invoices by vendor. So we select the vendor ID, count of asterisk is invoice quantity, from invoices grouped by vendor ID. So we're going to get one summary row per vendor ID, and then we're going to get a count of the rows that were summarized into that row. So 2 rows were summarized into 34, 3 into 37, 1 row into 48, 2 rows into 72. Okay. Now, here we've got 34 rows. Okay. What does that mean? Well, that means that we have invoices for 34 of our 122 vendors. Okay. We have 122 vendors, but we didn't get any, we didn't ask for, we didn't do a, yeah, so we didn't ask for the vendor IDs that didn't have any invoices. To do that, we would have to join the vendors table to in the invoices table with a left join. If we just look at invoices, well, then of course only the vendors that have invoices are mentioned, and there are only 34 of them, which means the rest of that 122 vendors don't have any invoices in the system right now. Okay. Here's a summary query with a join. Okay. So let's see. Let's see what tables we're joining. Invoices join vendors on vendor ID. Okay, it's kind of like what I was talking about. We're going to select vendor state, vendor city, count of the rows that qualify, round average of invoice total as invoice average. Okay, we're going to group by vendor state, vendor city, order by vendor state, vendor city. Okay. Now, so we have Arizona Phoenix, 1 invoice. California Fresno, 19 invoices. California Los Angeles, 1. California Oxnard, 3. Okay. Now, all this makes sense to me. Hopefully, I'm going to hope it makes sense to you. Okay. So we're looking for the vendor state and the vendor city and the count of invoices. Okay. We're only going to get the ones that have invoices. Okay. We don't get the same number that we had previously. We had 34. That was one row per vendor ID. This is the one we're doing now is one row per state and city location, and some of those have more than one vendor. Probably Fresno and Oxnard have more than one vendor. So that's why we have 20 rows instead of what we have 34 over there. Okay. Notice that we have an order by. Okay. Now, it used to be true before the latest release or releases of MySQL, before version 8. It used to be true that you could leave off the order by if you wanted it in the same order as the group by. That's no longer true. Okay? So we're going to want you to code an order by even when you code a group by. So we did it here. Okay, let's see. Did we do it on the last one? We had a group by there, but we didn't have an order by. Okay. Would make sense to always have an order by to go with your group by. We have a group by on the one before, we have an order by. So I'm going to say that I'd like you to always have an order by to go with your group by. Okay. Okay, where we are. Okay, here's a summary query that limits the groups to those with 2 or more invoices. How would we do that? Having. Okay, let's look. So the beginning of this, let's see, we're joining invoices and vendors on a vendor ID. That's the same. We're asking for vendor state, vendor city, count of the qualifying rows, round of the average invoice total. So those are the same columns. Okay. We're going to group by vendor state, vendor city. We're going to order by the same thing. That's a good practice. Okay, but we're saying having count of asterisk, having count of qualifying rows in that group greater than or equal to 2. Okay, so again, what does having do? Well, after the grouping and the summarization is done, the having is a great way to get rid of summary rows, to suppress summary rows based upon a condition so that you only get the summary rows that you want. In this case, we're probably saying that we don't want trivial rows. Okay, we just want the rows that have 2 or more invoices because we want to concentrate on the ones that are more significant. Okay, look good. Now we're down to only 12 rows. Makes sense? Okay. Now, a summary query with the search condition in the having clause. Okay. Now, it turns out, all right, that it's possible to have both a where clause and a having clause. So we're just going to explore that a bit so that you know what's possible, and then also by the time we're done, what the good practices are. Okay? So this is pretty much the same queries you had before with say having average invoice a total greater than 500. Okay. Now, I just want to remind you, you always should be thinking about is the endpoint included or not. So if this says greater than 500, that means if it's exactly 500, it's not going to be that summary row is not going to be included. Okay, so let's look. What do we get? 2,500, 800, 23,000, 600. Yeah, that worked. Okay. And then we said order by invoice quantity descending. Well, now what is interesting here is we're not ordering by the same thing that we're grouping by. The last couple we did, okay, but you don't have to, right? Um, when you're doing group by, we'd like you to do to include an order by as well. That wasn't always the practice in the past, but it's the good practice now. Okay. So this is having that screens out all the groups that have an average invoice a total less than or equal to 500. All right. Let's look at the next one. It didn't go to the next one. That did. So a summary query with a compound condition in the having clause. Okay. So let's see. Invoice date. So we want to select the invoice date. Count of asterisk as invoice quantity. Sum of invoice total from invoices grouped by invoice date. So we can ask for invoice date when we're summarizing when we're grouping by invoice date. Okay? When we weren't doing that, then we couldn't ask for the column. Okay? Having invoice date between these two values, remember, again, when you look at this, these are inclusive. Okay, so if it's between, it includes the low one and includes the high one. Okay, and count of rows greater than 1 and sum of invoice total greater than 100. Okay, so let's see, we get 7 rows. Okay, and yeah, we get 7 rows. So these are the invoice dates. This is the quantity. This is the sum of the invoices. Okay. Now, one of the things I just want to point out is that this we can have a test for the invoice date. Okay. In the having clause. Why? Well, because we're grouping by that. Okay, so everything in that group has the same invoice date. Okay, so when we look at the having, the test for the invoice date, it relates to the whole group. The test for the count, it relates to the whole group. The test for the sum, it relates to the whole group. Okay. Now, in the next version that you're going to see, we're going to do it slightly differently. Okay. Because each individual row has an invoice date, you can screen out the ones that you don't want before you summarize them. Okay. And this is where you have to start thinking of the workflow that goes on, right? You know, before we got to grouping and summarizing, you'll remember that the workflow was you identified the columns that you wanted, right? And then it went and it started to get the rows for you. But the rows that it put into the results set had to pass the test in the where clause, right? So the where clause here is we're getting rid of the rows that are not between these two dates. Okay, so these rows don't even get into summarization. Okay, so then when they go to group by, okay, There are no groups that are not between these dates because they weren't included before we began to group and summarize. And then in the having, we we have the count, which is of course uh, a function of the group, and the sum, which is a function of the group as well. So we get 7 rows here. Okay, so these are 2 ways to do the same thing. The only reason why these are equivalent to each other is that the invoice date is what we're summarizing on. So we can decide to screen out values in the invoice date either in the where clause or in the having clause. Okay. I think Joel Maroc says in the text he prefers to put them all in the having clause. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. Now, summary rows. Okay. When you're summarizing things, there are times when you want a summary row. You either want a grand total, you want a total for the whole report that you have there, or maybe you want some subtotals along the way and you want a grand total too, right? Well, we have this thing called with rollup that allows us to get those. Pretty nice. So let's see, we're selecting from invoices, vendor ID, account of asterisk, sum of invoice total from invoices, group by vendor ID with rollup. What does that mean? Well, it means it's going to group it by vendor ID. So vendor ID 119 has one invoice. That's 4901 and 26 cents, and then on and on and on. And then the last one, which has a null, that's their way of saying this isn't for a particular vendor ID. This is the roll-up row. Okay. There are 114 invoices in it. That makes sense because that's what we have in the table. And the total is $214,000 and some change. That makes sense. We've seen that before. Okay. Now, you might say, gee, a null there. I'd rather it said something other than null. Maybe total or yeah, total all vendors or something like that. I mean, can't you think of something that you'd rather have there than a null? Well, one of the new features that we're going to talk about in part 2 is going to solve that problem. But up until version 8, this is all we had. Okay, so, and people were able to get by with it. Okay, when you look over it and you go, okay, if I have a null in a column, it means it's not for a particular value in that column, it's for all the values. Okay, so it's not for a particular vendor ID, it's the sum for all the vendors' IDs, all the vendor IDs, and that's it. And typically it's going to come out last. All right? Pretty handy, wouldn't you agree? Okay. So it's possible, okay, as soon as you see that, you go, oh, but can I do it for the groups, right? Where I'm doing a group by, can I do that? And yeah, I can. I just need to mention 2 columns, 2 different columns that I want to do the group by on, and then I can just say with roll up at the end. Okay. So what I do, let's see. This is from vendors. We're getting the vendor state, vendor city, count of rows, qualifying rows, right? From vendors where vendor state is in either Iowa or New Jersey. That's just so we don't have a long result set. Group by vendor, state, vendor, city with rollup. Okay. So vendor, state, vendor, city. So Fairfield, Iowa has one vendor. Washington, Iowa has one vendor. Null, Iowa, okay, all of Iowa, roll-up Iowa has two vendors. Well, that makes sense. It's the sum of 1 and 1. In New Jersey, East Brunswick, pretty close where I went to college, has two. Fairfield has one. Washington has one. That's a total of 4. Okay, so we see 4. Okay, and then we get a grand roll-up. Okay, so for not a particular state or city, we get 6. That's a combination of 4 and 2. And again, it's a little hard to read these. I mean, they're not as user-friendly as they might be because you have to understand how to read the nulls. But once you understand how to read the nulls, they're pretty easy. And I promised you a new feature on the way that's going to help. Okay? Okay. The basic syntax of the grouping function. Oh, okay. So this will be just a foreshadowing here with this slide. This is part of the new material we're going to talk about in part 2 that is going to help to solve some of the problems we have with these nulls not being as pretty as we'd like them to be. Okay? New feature coming in part 2. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye until part 2. Bye-bye.